And do you think that is something that this might spark more of a conversation about?
I think we're going to have a lot of conversation about it.
Strong stance on inclusion that prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender. Why hasn't the city of Grandville done that? And do you think that is something that this might spark more of a conversation about?
I think we're going to have a lot of conversation about it. I think that would, like typically we don't make what some people would find as political statements. Some people would say, no, it's not a political statement, it's just about human rights. But I think probably the city would look to the state. It will be interesting.
Chance to talk to you about some of the research evidence. In the case of this field, certainly much more in terms of the knowledge gaps about the effectiveness of anti-bullying legislation and reducing bullying and related behaviors. We were fortunate enough to have access to a data set where we could link this ecologic data on the prevalence of anti-bullying policies at the county level to individual level health outcomes among lesbian and gay youth who live in those different counties. And we were able to do that with a data set from Oregon called the Oregon Healthy Teen Study. This provided information on health, sexual orientation, and fortuitously also the counties where the kids lived in. And so that enabled us to link this policy level information to this data set. These are annual probability-based surveys are representative of Oregon's 11th grade public school students, and they're modeled on the YRBS data sets that were designed by the CDC to measure the leading causes of morbidity and mortality among youth. So these are the data here. On the y-axis here is the prevalence of suicide attempts in the past year, and on the x-axis is that inclusive anti-bullying policy variable that I just mentioned. And we divided this into tertiles, ranging from the least inclusive counties to the most inclusive counties. So we operationalize the most inclusive counties as those that have the greatest proportion of their school districts with these anti-bullying policies that specifically include sexual orientation. And then what we did is just simply look at what's the prevalence of suicide attempts among lesbian and gay youth within each of these tertiles. And here are these results. So you can see substantial variation in a level of suicide attempts as a function of living in these different counties. So we find that 31% of lesbian and gay youth living in the least inclusive counties had attempted suicide in the past year, compared to only 16% living in the most inclusive counties. And our odds ratios indicate that lesbian and gay youth are over 2 times more likely to have attempted suicide in the past year if they lived in one of the less inclusive counties compared to the most inclusive. And these results remain robust when we adjust for several different covariates at both the individual and the county level. Briefly mentioned that these findings in terms of the relationship between bullying policies and bullying behaviors are very consistent with several studies that my colleagues and I and others have done showing that social policies surrounding LGBT populations can in very powerful ways shape their health and well-being. So there's certainly precedence in the literature showing that social policies can have important downstream health consequences. Additional results in this study. First is we were able to code these policies in a couple different ways. So first is we could, of course, look at whether or not there was actually an anti-bullying policy or not. But secondly, we were able to see whether or not the anti-bullying policy enumerated specific groups. So that is, either they didn't enumerate groups at all, or if they did, they listed several different groups but did not specifically include sexual orientation. And then finally, again, we were able to look at whether or not they did include sexual orientation in their list of protected class statuses. And I think one of the more interesting findings to emerge is that we find that policies that do not include sexual orientation as a protected class are not protective of lesbian and gay youth in terms of reducing the risk of suicide attempts. So the policy specifically has to include this group in its enumerated list in order to exert this protective effect. These inclusive anti-bullying policies were also associated with a reduced risk for peer victimization for all youth, including LGBT youth as well as heterosexual youth. And although the Oregon Healthy Teen Study doesn't include a specific measure of bullying, these results are also suggestive that these inclusive anti-bullying policies may be effective in reducing various forms of peer aggression, including bullying, although that needs to be replicated in a sample that actually includes measures of bullying behaviors.
Brian and Sue. Part of the presentation focused on statistics, numbers used to show the purpose of OK to Say. Stats like 1 out of 4 teens have been the target of electronic abuse, and suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death in Michigan kids ages 10 to 19.
Because I think it's important for me to remember that what I say and what I do, and this applies to everybody, affects the way that other people think and feel, and it affects our community.
Okay.
Because I think it's important for me to remember that what I say and what I do, and this applies to everybody, affects the way that other people think and feel, and it affects our community.